All right, let's find the lecture for chapter 1. There it is. All right. So, mobile device active share. Android is more popular than iOS. Everything else is down in the small change. Android is more popular because it's open source. You can make an Android phone of any type, and therefore there are thousands of different phones with different hardware, different sizes, and the cheapest ones are often sold in appallingly insecure states. If you don't obey certain security measures, Google will not let you put Google apps on the phone, like Google Play Store. For example, if you sell it rooted, or with Android debugging turned on and so on, or if malware pre-installed on it, all these things can happen with the cheapest phones. If you get a more expensive phone, then it's really quite good, probably as good as an iPhone. But they vary greatly in quality of every kind, but by flooding the market with many different form factors, they sell more Android phones. It is possible to get an Android phone much cheaper than an iPhone. All right, so the attack surface is all the ways attacks can come in. It can come in from over the Wi-Fi. People can steal the phone and try to get the stored data off it. This is what most forensic examiners do, of course. They find a phone at a crime scene or seize it from a suspect, and then they go on the phone to take the data. You can put malicious apps on the phone. This is very common in the Android ecosystem, less common in the iPhone ecosystem and so you install a malicious app, and now the attacker has control of that app, like Drozer, and they try to steal the data that way. And there's other input sources, QR codes, camera, microphone, Bluetooth, that could be used to attack the phone also. So here's some of the common mobile application vulnerabilities. Leakage of sensitive data, very common. Hard-coded passwords. Injection, which means that some input that should not have been a command can be used to inject a command, which executes at the other end, like SQL injection or command line injection. Lack of binary protections. Almost every app has this, and I found this to be true. This is where you can take the app, decompile it, modify it, and make a modified version of the app that will run. This is ridiculous. It's dangerous. It is not hard to prevent, but nobody does. I started auditing what I thought would be the most secure apps in the world, the top 10 banks, insurance brokers, and stockbrokers, and they're all vulnerable to this. The only app I found that is not vulnerable to this is the NFL app, the National Football League, because they were one of the first apps on the Android phone, and some researcher published a scathing article about all their insecurities, and they were embarrassed, so they actually secured their app. And you know, there are apps that are smart. You can easily tell if an app has been modified, and when you turn on the app, if it's been modified, it will say that you have an old version, you have to update before you can use it. But you can modify any major bank app so it does something horrible, like steal your credit card numbers and passwords, and it will just cheerfully connect to the bank and let you use it. So if I can trick you into installing this fake bank app, you will totally have no clue that bad things are happening. They just don't bother to put in a security test to say, wait a minute, does the hash of this app match the expected hash? If not, refuse to do anything, force them to update the app first. That's a very reasonable security measure, but almost nobody bothers. And then integer transmission is extremely common. That's why we're using Burp to monitor the network traffic coming from the apps. A lot of apps either send secrets without encrypting it at all, or they use broken SSL. They encrypt things with TLS, but they fail to validate the certificate with a third party. So all you have to do is send them a fake certificate, and now they'll cheerfully use the wrong key to encrypt it and hand the data to the attacker. A lot of apps have this flaw, something like 10% of them on both iPhone and Android. And a lot more when this guy tested them. And insecure data storage is another big one. This is something I did for hundreds of apps. I would just make an account, stay logged in, and now search to see if my password is stored on the phone. And it's almost more than half the time it is stored on the phone, either in plain text or with reversible encryption, which means they used private key encryption and then they hid the key somewhere. So all I have to do is find the key, which is not very hard since I can read your source code, so it's ridiculous. There's no reason to do this at all. As I mentioned last time in that DEF CON lecture, if you think you have to store a secret on the phone, you are wrong. Think about your app design. You don't really need to store a secret on the phone. But if you can't figure out how to make your app work without storing a secret on the phone, put it in the place for secrets, which is the keychain. There is a special service provided in the operating system to store secrets. The iPhone keychain, and Android has a similar secure device. That's where you should put things, but app developers just don't bother to learn that, and they invent their own cryptography. Anytime you're writing your own cryptography, just ram your head against the wall and stop. Never write your own cryptography. You think you're smart enough, and all you're going to learn is you are not smart enough. Everybody thinks they're smart about cryptography, and when you learn about cryptography, you find out it's harder than you think. You should use a standard solution that has been tested and developed by real experts. Use the keychain. That's what it's for. Don't invent your own. This will always just lead to humiliation. Anyway, so the main problem is underdeveloped security awareness. The developers typically do not understand security, and they write insecure code. One of my consulting gigs, I'm helping a company teach security to their developers because they're having to pay so much money to solve the problems their developers write from writing insecure apps. And so if you just learn not to make like the top 10 mistakes, it would save your company a ton of money and embarrassment, as the app wouldn't have these problems. Here's a fun fact about security. If you discover a security flaw during the design phase of an app, it will cost a certain amount of time and money to fix. But if you discover it after the development process in quality assurance, and then you have to bounce it back for rework, it will cost 10 times as much and start making things miss deadlines and be late. But if you don't notice the flaw until it's shipped to the customer, and now you have to have recalls and updates and breach notification and all that, now it will cost 100 times as much to fix. So it's very good for your staff to consider security in the design phase of an app, right from the start, so you don't make these mistakes that will just balloon into bigger problems later. Anyway, OWASP has the top 10 device risk. OWASP is the Open Web Application Security platform or something. I don't know what the last is, but the point is it's a volunteer group of security professionals, and they come up with the 10 risks in many categories. And for the mobile devices, here they are: weak server-side controls. This is kind of a funny one. The number one mobile app vulnerability is not on the phone. It's on the server it talks to. I find this all the time. Now, when apps communicate with servers, and for that matter, web-based apps communicate with servers, they typically come in through the API. The server will have some endpoints, like a login API and a check balance API and a profile API and so on. So you'll have these requests you can make to the server, like, I want to log in, so I'm going to send up something like username and password, and you'll tell me whether I'm in. Then I want like my profile picture, so I'll have an API endpoint for that. Now, when you get my profile information, it should check to make sure you're logged in as that user before handing it out. And then there will be some administrative API endpoints, like create a new user and delete data, and those should all be checking to make sure you have the appropriate credentials to do these activities. Almost every company I see has API functions that do not check permissions correctly. This is extremely common. So there is an unprotected API call that you can call. For example, it does something administrative like create a new user, and you can call it without really having an administrator token to authorize it, because they just forget to turn it on or there's some kind of flaw. This is extremely common. And I thought it's kind of funny that the number one app vulnerability is not on the phone. It's actually on the server. Anyway, then insecure data storage, not using correct encryption, leaking data somewhere foolish like putting sensitive data in the logs, not handling authorization and authentication well, and using some kind of broken cryptography, injection, making security decisions based on untrusted inputs. This has happened a lot. For example, SAML is what our Canvas uses. You can see this go. SAML is security assertion markup language, and it's used to log in from one server to another. And you can send a SAML message, for example. A SAML message contains a security assertion, like I am the administrator, followed by an encrypted token to verify this. And there's one persistent problem is people forget to validate the encrypted part. So all I have to do is send it the claim that I'm the administrator and any garbage, and it will let me in as the administrator, because it just believes the assertion and doesn't bother to validate the proof, because that's hard. The kind of thing tends to happen. So that's making a security decision by an untrusted input. And then session handling is related to poor authorization, where you don't correctly keep track of who the user is. There's some way to get into your session. The most common attack I know here is stealing your cookie, and this works almost all over the web. If I can steal your authorization cookie, then I can log in as you. This worked for about half the websites on the web. I did a few hundred websites, or maybe 100 a few years ago, because Office 365 was vulnerable to it, and I tried a lot of other websites. And if I managed to steal your session cookie, you're pretty much hosed. When you log out, the old cookie code works. When you change your password, the old cookie still works. The only thing you can do is cancel the account and make a new account on about half the websites. Hopefully it's less now, but I don't trust it very much. It is amazing. When a customer logs out, you should invalidate the cookie, but the default platforms don't do that. Anyway, and then lack of binary protections, that's the one I talk about, where you can modify the app and the modified app will still run. That is not hard to prevent, but people just don't bother. And it's appalling. I think game designers, by the way, pay more attention to this because they don't want people stealing their code and putting it in another game. So they will scramble the code to make it harder to steal. Anyway, let me check here for comments. Is there a way to do CTFs for this class? Yes, I can turn that on. I'm glad you reminded me. I often do. Probably by next week I'll get that set up. I can put a link at the bottom where you can do a CTF instead of Canvas. There's always a few students that would like to do that. Thank you for reminding me. All right, and so here we are. We talked about the server-side controls is actually on the phone, and we got a whole class on these web apps, securing web apps. It's not taught this semester, but it will be. This is one of our most important classes. And we talked about this insecure data storage, insecure transport layer protection, data leakage in the many places it can go, poor authorization, broken cryptography, client-side injection. These are common failures, doing something foolish with an encryption key. Trusting something like a signal that came from another app, believing it without verifying it. This, by the way, is the part of the modern zero trust movement. The federal government has said all companies should be moving towards zero trust. Now, the model that Microsoft recommended until 2001 was the kind of model like you see in this room. You have a bunch of computers, and you have a router or firewall on the way out, and everything in the room is trusted. And then you have one security barrier like the firewall that keeps the bad stuff out, and you trust everything within the boundary. This was the old model. This is no longer a good model because there's malware that infects machines, that gets past things. There's people that bring in portable devices and phones and stuff. So you, inside your so-called security boundary, you can't really trust everything. So zero trust is where every time you get a request from any device for a service, you check it to say, does this appear to be a valid request, or does this look suspicious? Don't trust anybody. That's what you should do. And here's the point here, untrusted inputs. When you get a signal from another app on the phone, you just decide, well, that must be okay because there couldn't be a malicious app on the phone. That is not a good decision. There could very well be a malicious app on the phone sending malicious input, so you should be verifying it. And by the way, one thing I saw this week in the news that was awesome is the newest version of iOS has a special security mode that will protect your phone, and what it does is it keeps track of the physical location of your phone, and it notices where you commonly are. So you're at home, you're at school, you're at work. If you're in a normal location, your phone works normally. But if you're in an unexpected location, now a bunch of things are more difficult to do. When you log in, it will only take biometrics, not passwords or anything. And if you try to do something suspicious, like change your iCloud password, it will force you to do a biometric authentication, wait an hour, and do another biometric authentication. Therefore, if somebody steals your phone, it will be really hard for them to do really bad things. This is a really good idea. And if you're a normal user, then you'll be okay because you're going to familiar places. This seems like a really wise security feature to me. It's not on by default, but I would definitely, maybe I'll turn it on my phone. If I think I do have a phone with the latest OS now, finally. Anyway, I'll check. If you can, I would recommend turning it on. That's the kind of way to make a good security barrier.
The 1 hour wait is just to make sure the original owner called in something?
Well, the 1 hour wait is just to make sure it's really you. So, for example, a criminal could steal your phone in a coffee house. They might be able to point it at your face once and get a biometric authentication without you noticing, but they probably couldn't wait an hour and do that again. That's the idea, you know. It seems like a pretty good plan. So if it's really a stolen phone, they will detect that it's doing suspicious things and not fall for it. Really, everybody should be doing this. Like, one thing I don't understand, frankly, is ransomware. Ransomware, you get infected, now your computer starts encrypting thousands of files. Why doesn't your computer just refuse to change more than 10 files every minute ever? And if you change more than 10 files in a minute, it will pop up alerts and shut down and do things like that. Why do you need to save 1,000 files in 5 minutes? It should be pretty obvious that something bad is happening. I don't know why that isn't, a defense is not turned on. It seems to me like it wouldn't be that difficult to detect these obviously suspicious activities, and at least Apple is making some progress at doing that. So there are mobile security tools. There's frameworks to develop secure iOS apps. There are deliberately insecure apps for practice. And there's a special mobile pen testing distribution I've never used. I've never used any of these except GoatDroid. First time I taught this class, I used one of these deliberately insecure apps, and it was really primitive and hard to set up and really dull. And then I started auditing real apps, and now we're just going to use real apps. There's so many real apps that are unsafe, and I've told the developer, and they don't care, so now they're homework. They get humiliated every time. So that's what I did. I investigated banks, insurance and stockbrokers, and then I found a few years ago the Computer Emergency Response Team tested every app in the Android store, and they notified everyone that broke TLS. And there were thousands that broke TLS, and I went and manually tested them like a year later, and I found a bunch more that still broke TLS because their automated test was pretty sloppy. It wasn't as good as a manual test. And so I found them and told them, so I found medical apps and everything else. It's real easy to find apps making these flaws. So I found these banks, they're all insecure to code injection, to a code modification, and many other things. TD Ameritrade in particular is the special mention. They did something bad like put the password in a log, and then when I told them about it, they put 2 copies of the password in a log. They made it worse. So they didn't even move in the right direction. Although I must say, 7 years later, at least one of these companies actually hired me as a consultant to help them improve their security practices. So eventually, some of them began to become aware of security. But all these guys were insecure, and we'll be using several of these companies' apps for homework. You'll hack into them the way I did. All right, and here's some following stuff. Home Depot has reversed. These guys also have password stored reversible encryption. Safeway totally does. Kroger, Walgreens, they all store your password with a private key, which they've generated using simple things like the name of the app and the process ID or something, and you can totally recreate it and steal the password off the phone. So it's rude and totally unnecessary. There are a lot of app developers that just have bad habits and don't seem to have any security awareness at all, and apparently the customers buying the apps also have no security awareness. They don't bother to do the simplest auditing. So if you just learn to do the simple tests we're going to do in this class, you could make your company a lot better than the average, because most of them use apps that have ridiculous flaws. And if I was hiring someone to write an app, I would refuse to. No, I'm not taking it. Fix this. You've got to at least not have like one of the top 10 vulnerabilities, or I'm not paying for the app. That would only be reasonable. And it's ridiculous that people can get away with selling apps that have these ridiculous vulnerabilities, but they do. So let's try another Kahoot. This is the Chapter 1 Kahoots. I heard about this for years, that apps are extremely vulnerable, and it is very much true. Even the ones from rich, important companies that ought to do better. I mean, I would understand if games were not secure because what they're doing is not that important, but banks and insurance companies ought to be secure. They're handling large amounts of money, and it really matters. However, to be fair, the number one risk is usually social engineering anyway, where you send them a phishing SMS or something. So in some sense, they're probably right to not bother fixing the vulnerabilities in their app because that's not really the flaw that causes the most harm to their customers. But still, I think it's unprofessional, and they're beginning to see that as they get more mature about this. Well, everybody ought to get this right. The most popular OS. Boy, I remember BlackBerry. They were real popular in their day, maybe 10 years ago. What's that? Yeah, I never heard of security problems. Just they went out of business. Yeah, people really liked that manual keyboard too. That was real popular. In fact,
they're still making money. They sell the secure OS.
yeah. Oh, that's right. They're still around. You're right, but they're not selling those devices anymore. Anyway,
They're making money.
They're making money. Oh, okay. Well, good. But anyway, they don't sell those BlackBerry devices anymore. Well, I remember Obama had one and he loved it.
They're not in the hardware business, they're in
Yeah.
the software business.
Yeah. All right. What's the most common app vulnerability? Lack of binary protections, which is failure to have integrity control where you can modify the app and it will still run. Almost every app has this, more than 90% of them. Insecure data storage is not that common. I mean, it's there. I think insecure data storage is probably at like 25% of the apps, but this is like 95% of apps have this vulnerability. And what's the largest security problem for mobile apps? Yes, the insecure servers. And by the way, if you expand your thinking out of just technical flaws, the number one flaw is the user being tricked into making a mistake. And this is true. Humans are usually the weak spot in your security model. You know, tricking the user into making a mistake is usually the best way to hack anything. Don't even bother with technical solutions. Just trick the user into doing something dumb. That's time-honored. That's been around before these devices. It'll be around after them. That's the really hard thing to fix. All right, if an app puts passwords in the syslog, which vulnerability is that? That's data leakage, where data is going into some unsafe place. This, by the way, you could say is what happened to the NSA. The NSA developed a powerful Windows exploit, and one of their contractors installed it on a system that was not secure, and they're running Kaspersky antivirus, which detected it and sent it to Russia, so the Russians had it. That's unintended data leakage. That's the thing. You store something in the wrong place where everybody can get it. Another thing, by the way, that used to be pretty popular, I heard about this a lot 10 years ago, is people would join BitTorrent, and they would just share their entire C drive on BitTorrent with all their passwords and everything. A ton of them did that. They wanted to share their music, but they would just share the whole drive. It was quite common. And really, it came back again because Amazon block storage, until about 2 years ago, the default for Amazon storage was to be world readable by everyone. So there was an amazing number of breaches where whole databases from insurance companies and everybody were just wide open because people wanted to move to the cloud. So they would take images of their physical servers from the data center and just put them on Amazon. And they didn't understand that the security environment was different. And Amazon didn't change it until about 2 years ago. I mean, this is really, it was their default. If you just went next, it would be world readable by everyone. And that was not the wisest thing to do, you know? You probably don't really want to make it word readable by everyone, but of course, then it'll work. If all you care about is functionality, that'll do it. That's like everybody running as administrator all the time. But if you think about security, it's bad. So anyway. Well, yeah. Anyway, a little too free. So Pete's won twice, and there's a new winner called No Free Lunch. By the way, if you use a name like that, you won't get your points unless you tell me who you really are. But I record it in case you tell. Oh, you're not really in this class? Oh, that's fine. Okay. You're No Free Lunch? What was that?
They were talking about SDLC today.
SELT?
SDLC, Software Development Lifecycle.
Oh, yeah, Software Development Lifecycle, that's right.
And they did not mention security in the entire
Oh, well, yeah, that's an issue, yeah. Well, that's the problem. Most programming classes don't cover security. It's been an argument for years, whether, yeah, well, they consider it to be too much work and such, so, all right. This is a common